All right, it's 1 p.m. Time to kick this off. Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. We have a very exciting, informative, and valuable webinar for you today. I'm very honored and pleased to have Sharon Muscato, who's a friend that I've known for a couple of years now, join me in presenting what I feel is a critical and important topic for all of our compliance folks in this space. And it's a good time as any. You know, we're all at home, and hopefully we can spare an hour to go through this. So I've known Sharon, as I said, for a couple of years. She's been a good friend and someone that I've reached out to for quite some advice over this period. And I've had the pleasure of seeing this particular topic presented by Sharon last year at the May conference hosted by CBI, which was under the umbrella of Global Transparency. And I was really impressed as to the journey that Sharon had taken and the systems approach to transparency and disclosure reporting that she had implemented. At that time, she had done it at Merck, and now since the last year, she has had the take two of it as an opportunity to create the same piece at Alexion Pharma. So just to give you some background on Sharon, she's been in compliance space within pharma and device for a very long period, and she was based out of Germany, where she first created a global reporting program at EMD Serono. And now, as I mentioned, she's moved to Boston, where she works at Alexion Pharma and has been busy redoing the same activity at Alexion. I really, besides her biography, I like her quote at the end: "Compliance and efficiency are not mutually exclusive." So very excited and welcome to you, Sharon, to this webinar.
Okay. Thanks so much, Mohammed. Really appreciate the intro, and hello, everybody. Looking forward to our discussion today.
Great, thank you, Sharon. And just a quick word about myself, founder and CEO at Core Data, and for the last 4 years have been busy creating a compliance solution for pharma and device companies that has an underpinning in data and analytics. So very excited to be host of this webinar, and my role in this webinar is going to be very limited, but hope we'll get a lot of value from Sharon. Just some housekeeping items up front. You can ask questions through the GoToMeeting panel. There should be 2 different sections. There's a question section and a chat box. Either of those should work. Again, this is just a legal disclaimer. The views and opinions expressed by the speakers, these are our own and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or the position of either Alexion or Core Data. We will record this webinar, and for those that aren't able to make it, or even for the ones that are here, you will get a copy of it. So if you need to use it or refer to it later, you'll have access to it. All the lines are muted, and of course, slides are copyrighted. And if you need help through this webinar that you cannot get using chat or questions, there's also a webinar support line that you can call in, and we'll be happy to assist you. Looks like a major portion of the folks have already joined. So what I'll do is, at this point, Sharon, I'd like to transition this over to you. And I'll make you the presenter, so you can take it forward from here.
Perfect.
Okay, I just transitioned the presenter rights to you, Sharon. Okay, we're seeing the screen.
Everyone sees my screen okay?
Yes, we can see your screen, Sharon.
Perfect. Okay, so thanks again, Mohammed, for that introduction. These topics, I can literally speak hours and hours upon all of them. I know some of you on the line, and you will probably get a chuckle at that. I will try to limit myself and stay on point and stay on message. So to help me do that, let's go through. Why is my, oh, that's right. We learned this before. There we go. Again, to repeat what Mohammed said, this is our disclaimer. These are my views, not necessarily that of Alexion, and this certainly does not constitute legal advice. The topics I'd like to cover today is, first of all, to just talk about my journey. Starting from working in a pharma company that was under a CIA, and ultimately leading to a role to head up a global transparency team. Through that journey, there were a number of program level learnings that I discovered that I think are beneficial to share. And not just learnings, but big wins. And this goes to what I call my motto, right? That compliance and efficiency are not mutually exclusive. You'll see as we talk about some of the big wins we were able to deliver, those were big wins not only for compliance, but also for the business. I do want to take a closer look at one of the components of this overarching infrastructure that I'll be walking through, and that's what we call our planning and approval tool, because that's a really core piece of the component of the infrastructure. And I think a lot of you, at least those of you who are at minimum involved with the HCP engagement process, you'll find this beneficial. And then a number of you are also involved with cross-border interactions, right? And are fully aware of some of the challenges they present. So I have some tips on that topic, as well as some things you might want to consider when you're trying to connect your various systems. And then I want to end with a bird's eye view of how I've set up this type of infrastructure in the past and what I'm currently trying to set up at my new organization, which is Alexion. And of course, we'll end with questions and answers, but as Mohammed noted, if you have questions during the presentation, feel free to use the chat box. I really do want to make this a back and forth, so don't feel you have to wait till the very end for any of the questions you may have. So before we actually get started into my journey, I want to hear a little bit more about you guys, so I understand kind of what your perspective is as we go through the next slides. So we do have a polling question. So I'm going to ask Mohammed to launch our the polling service. And the first question I want you guys to respond to is about the scope of what your responsibilities are for disclosure reporting, right? Specifically HCP and HCO disclosure reporting, whether it's specific to the US or maybe an expanded region, whether it's global, or maybe you haven't figured this out yet. This is something you're contemplating, or you don't have any responsibility for disclosure reporting. I just want to get a sense of what the scope of your responsibilities are across this audience. So we're going to keep this open for another minute or so. I'll rely on Mohammed to tell me when we think we got a good amount of responses.
We almost have everyone responded, Sharon, so I can, it's almost 85% of the folks have responded, so I'll close the poll in just 5 seconds. Here we got up to almost 90. So it looks like everyone that wanted to respond has a chance to respond, so we'll close the poll and we'll be able to see the results here. It's primarily US only is our audience, with some global and some regional responsibilities.
Got it. Now, is it because I'm in slideshow presentation, Mohammed, that I can't see the results of the poll? Probably, right?
You should be, if you exit out of the slide share, you should be able to see that. And perhaps for the polling part, if you want to stay outside the slideshow, maybe you can see the results as well.
That's okay. I can rely on what you. So the vast majority is US only at this point.
Yeah, let me read it out to you. So it's US only 68%, and then region specific is 21%, and global is 11%.
Okay, all right, so some mixture there. Very helpful, thanks. So let me go to my next slide, or the next question. So that was disclosure reporting. So now let's talk about HCP engagements. And I'm looking in this case, not so much about the scope, but who owns the process, right? Who's responsible for the, is there ownership over the process or governance over the process? And if so, what does that look like? So the responses here, there's really no ownership or governance. Very much HCP engagements happen the way they happen all over the place. Or maybe there is some level of governance, but it's split according to geography or function, meaning commercial has their way of doing HCP engagements and medical might have their way, or the US does it their way and France does it their way. There's also the concept of centralized ownership at a local level. So for one entity, they all do it the same way, or the centralized ownership could be at a global level. Like if you have a global headquarters, they kind of dictate what that process looks like, and then everyone might execute locally, but the ownership of the framework of the process is owned globally by headquarters. And then of course, we always have the not sure and none of the above.
Okay, I've already launched the poll. It looks like half the audience has already responded and the votes are coming in.
Excellent.
Yeah, as soon as we get a good percentage, I'll close it out and share the results with you, Sharon.
Super.
Maybe another 15 seconds. So if anyone wants to vote, you have a few more seconds. Okay, looks like close to 80% vote. So I'll close this out and share the results. So what we have is, Sharon, for your information, the no ownership, which is the first option, is 12%. Ownership governance split across according to geography and or function is 47%. So that's almost half the audience. Yep. And then centralized ownership governance at a local level is about 12%. And then centralized ownership governance at a global level is 24%, so about a quarter. And then we have 6% of not sure.
Got it. Very helpful. Thank you so much. All right, and the last question for now is, when we're talking about ownership, I'm curious as to the overlap between the groups that own disclosure reporting and the groups that own the HCP engagement process. So are they completely different teams, so no overlap? Or maybe they're different teams, but they work well together, they collaborate, so there's some overlap there? Or whether they're owned completely by the same, one team. And then of course, whether or not, if you're not sure, pick D.
Okay, I just launched the poll, so audience should have the options showing up on their screen to vote. All right, looks like we have almost half the folks have already voted. So this might be quicker than the other polls. People are getting used to how to provide their input. Okay, we'll give another maybe 20 seconds or so. We're already at 80%. And this is a good question, Sharon, because in my experience also, as I'm looking at our customer base, which is now over 25 pharma and device customers, we do see a mix where some have it one way, some have it the other way. So I'll close the poll and share the results. So I'll read it out for you, Sharon, again. For the option number 1, which is no overlap, we have about 28%, so perhaps 1/3. Some overlap is about 39%, so maybe almost close to 40% there. And then complete overlap which is one team owns both areas, is about 33%. So approximately the first three options are all about one third.
Yep. Excellent. Okay, thank you. That's very, very helpful. So now let's move on to my journey. So as I mentioned, I started for a company. It was EMD Serono, which is a subsidiary of Merck KGaA, the German Merck. And I joined EMD Serono in 2010. And it was to help build their US transparency program. And at the time, they were just about to get their CIA extended, right? So with that came, right now, at this point in time, I'm sure a lot of you are aware, there was no federal law, right? Obama had just signed the ACA, but there was no sunshine reporting. That wasn't going to go into effect until the middle of 2013, which is when we had to start, having data collected, and we would report that data in 2014. But in 2010, we still had some states that were requiring spend reporting for HCPs and HCOs. So EMD Serono wanted to have an automated way to do that. So they brought me on to help build this program to help automate how they collected spend. So what we, for any data project, we want to have some level of data validation. So we made sure that we were making sure that if we had to collect a date, it was a date. It was real basic data validation that we incorporated into our program. We also used a third-party reporting tool for, again, just state reporting. But then we had to use that tool and work with that vendor to customize what we called sunshine-like reporting, because that was required by our CIA. So even though Sunshine, we didn't have the requirements yet, our CIA was basically guessing at what those requirements were, and we had to meet those requirements on a regular basis by using this tool. It also required, and I bring this up because it touches upon not so much disclosure reporting, but on the HCP engagement process. Our CIA required that we have a centralized FMV process. Outside of the US, right? So again, we were a subsidiary of a global company. And so for rest of world, which is ROW, their transparency program was managed locally as applicable. So if France was, adopting some transparency laws around that time, well, the French entity was responsible for figuring out how to meet that. Any other country at that time would be locally responsible for collecting the data and reporting the data as required in that particular country. So moving forward to the 2012-2013 timeframe, we had now, we had our infant transparency program, right? We were doing what we needed to do. We were collecting the data, we were validating that data and meeting our reporting requirements as they were at that point in time. So with anything, we like to continuously improve, right? So we actually added what I call robust data validation, right? We actually put some sophisticated business rules and logic over the data. For example, we would identify where maybe our natures and purposes were incorrect for the spend source that we were pulling the data from, right? It wasn't just on the data quality, whether it was a date in the right format, et cetera. It was more about the context of the data, right? The classification of the data. We also added and got involved in the front end support of the HCP engagement planning, right? And this was kind of an offshoot of what we said about centralizing our FMV process. In order for us to do that, there was no, if you want to centralize an FMV process, you can't have a function do it. They're not centralized. We can't have commercial run our FMV, because what about R&D that are engaging those same HCPs? What about medical affairs, et cetera? So my team took that on, right, the centralization of FMV, and from there we actually built and added on this planning, which think of that as the needs assessment process, right? We kind of merged the needs assessment process with the FMV, centralization of FMV, and my team kind of took ownership of that. We also made some infrastructure adjustments, right? We realized at this point, okay, we have to report on location if we're reporting spend related to transportation or lodging. So that required some minor infrastructure adjustments so that we would be ready to go live with our reporting when Sunshine went into effect. Outside the US, our global headquarters decided to initiate the build of what we called, well, what I called the magical tool, because it was a one-stop shop. It was going to do everything. It was going to manage all of our ex-US HCP and HCO interactions. It was going to be where all the spend was, and it was going to do all of our reporting. And they were going to build that in 1 year. And then, so by 2014, right, so our US transparency program, we were now at the point where like, okay, our data, everything's flowing pretty well. Let's use this data for things other than transparency reporting. So we started building analytics and doing some dashboarding to help our monitoring and risk assessment process. This is also when we did our open payments reporting because it was now in effect. And this is also when we got out of our CIA. We actually successfully closed out our CIA. And so we no longer had to do that Sunshine-like reporting that had been required under the CIA. And then another thing that we did, and this was more on the HCP engagement side, we started leveraging the infrastructure that we had designed to incorporate what I call smart controls, right? Automated controls. Things like to manage our caps. We had a umbrella cap, right? Didn't matter if it was commercial, medical, certain types of activities were subject to the cap, and we were able to successfully automate how we managed those caps. We also did things like conflict of interest checks. So again, a whole host of smart controls that we implemented at this point in time. One of the best things, this goes to my motto, you know, efficiency and compliance are not mutually exclusive. We were able to add functionality to automatically generate HCP contracts and store them for the business. And this, I cannot tell you how far that went in making the business happy. And our lawyers as well, right? They didn't have to get bogged down in doing these blue plate contracts for 500 speakers. It just made everyone, the whole process, a lot more automated and efficient, and freed folks up to really focus on their core responsibilities. Outside the US, this is when that magical tool had been the design had been finished, and they were going live with this. And so we now had to use this tool as well. We, in the US, if we were engaging ex-US HCPs or HCOs. And this was a problem for our organization because it required us to kind of split up our process, right? Everything that I just described up until now, we were able to handle whether it was a US or a non-US HCP or HCO. But when this tool came out, we're like, oh, sorry, business, you now have to follow the headquarters process if you're dealing with a ex-US HCP. So just think about a global ad board, right? We have someone in medical affairs that's doing a global ad board inviting HCPs from US, Germany, Canada, and Italy. They couldn't do that in one process. They had to split it up. And so you can imagine how problematic that was. Fortunately, by 2017, that's when Merck decided, okay, it doesn't make sense to have the US doing things one way, the rest of the world doing things another way. So we actually created a global transparency program. We consolidated a lot of user feedback from people involved in both processes, the US and the ex-US. And thankfully, the senior leadership saw the benefit in actually taking the US approach by having different components of the process integrated, right, connected, but not try to put everything into one tool itself. So we then said, we're going to have a planning and approval process. We're going to have a process to collect spend. We're going to have a process to validate the data that we're collecting, and we're going to have a process to report. All of these components would be interconnected, but they're not all going to reside in one tool or system. And there was agreement that the global tool, which had tried to been that one-stop shop, they were now just going to make that the planning and approval tool. So the big wins that we got from doing that is that we were able to simplify a lot, right? So standardizing how we approached interactions, recipients, spend, et cetera, really simplified it. The example I like to give is that we established a global definitions framework, and we were able to consolidate all these different flavors of interactions as they were currently described in the bifurcated process world. We were able to consolidate that from 89 interaction types to 5 interaction types. We were also able to significantly decrease manual data entry. Because of how we standardize our information, a lot of the fields that had to be populated by the business were now drop downs, or sometimes they were even auto-populated based upon 2 or 3 fields that they had already populated. And we also incorporated what I called structured business group logic to help facilitate compliant interactions. And by that, I meant like we had business groups that we defined into policy groups. So commercial business groups, right? If they were sales, marketing, what have you, there was a policy logic that was assigned to them. So it would help the system behave in a way that would only show them functionality that were specific to commercial interactions. The same thing on the R&D side, and same thing on like the medical affairs side. This business group logic really made the systems much more customized for the people that were using it. Obviously, everyone I'm sure is aware of this. The HCP and HCO information that we need to manage is robust, especially when you do it globally. So we implemented a global MDM solution. We also, on the HCP and HCO side, we established a dynamic FMV rate structure, right? So by that, I mean, we needed to have governance over one process, right, to ensure consistency in how we were not just assigning FMV rates to individual HCPs, but over the activities as well. And because it's not always, depending on the activity, it's not always the hourly rate that matters for the to drive the compensation. The example I like to give is translation services. This is more, we saw this in a lot of the Chinese interactions in service engagements, where they would actually, the unit of measure that determined the compensation wasn't the number of hours, it was actually the number of characters being translated. And so we built into our infrastructure the ability to have flexibility in how FMV compensation was determined. But with that flexibility, we were still being very consistent, and there was governance over it. So we felt very confident in being able to defend our methodology if it should ever come into question. And then we actually consolidated this concept of HCP FMV profiling, meaning for HCPs where hourly rate was the factor in determining FMV compensation, we actually streamlined that process to assign an hourly rate to a specific HCP and then lock that rate. So once an HCP FMV profile was established, the business didn't have to do that again. they would just see that that profile already exists, and that rate would be the rate that anyone across the enterprise would pay that HCP should they engage that HCP for a service. This also really simplified our cross-border interactions. I'll get into a little bit more detail on that in the next couple of slides. And then we advanced the automation. Having that policy framework that I described earlier made certain selections visible to the business that were using it. It wasn't a free-for-all, right? It made the system lighter, if you will, right? And very configured for that particular business user that was interacting with the system at that point in time. It definitely helped us unify our global cap management. So again, we had one umbrella cap, and that cap wasn't for just what the US entity paid an HCP. It was for the full global enterprise. And because we had such standardized automated structures, it really helped us manage and ensure that we didn't go over our caps for these HCPs that were being used by not just multiple functions, but multiple legal entities within the global enterprise. And then the big win, as I already mentioned, was the ability to auto-generate and store the contracts. That was a huge win for the business. And that's the takeaway here, right? The biggest win was that this process was embraced by the business, because it wasn't just something that they were being forced to do because, you know, it was a compliance rule. It was actually an integrated system that basically facilitated them for following the rules, and at the same time made the process a lot more efficient for them. So what were my learnings on this, right? The big takeaway for me was that one-stop shop, it's like the magical unicorn. You know, it's, in my view, it's fantasy, especially when you have a large global organization where there's a lot of cross-border activity. So my learnings is that you should not only recognize, but you should protect each system's core purpose. And then focus on connecting those systems and processes through a consistent use of standardized data elements. Think of it as what I also call a definitions framework, right? You need to make sure that everyone aligns upon not just what an HCP is or what an HCO is, but what an ad board is, what an engagement is versus, say, an interaction that has no contract associated with it, right? A lunch and learn activity is completely different than an engagement for services, right? So the words we use matter, and it's really important that not only we as people align on what those words mean, but we have to bake those meanings into our systems and processes. And then incremental improvements are the way to go. This is complex information. So start with the basics, get the basics right, then add those bells and whistles. And I also encourage everyone to be curious about the details, right? And the nuances in this, because they matter. They certainly matter to the business, and they could also have an impact on the context behind the data that you're collecting. So ask a lot of questions and really ensure you understand these nuances. And then understand this is not a one and done process, right? It's not just a typical system implementation of, oh, here are the requirements, let's do our design of this, let's test it, and then let's just walk away from it because it's in place. This is not just a system, it's infrastructure. So there needs to be governance, right? It has to be strategic. You need to understand the operations behind these different systems. And if possible, really leverage qualified and engaged resources. It's easy to say, oh, well, they're on IT, you know, they'll be on this project. Oh, this person is, is a good operations person. Let's get them in. You really got to involve the right people with the knowledge and the skill set to understand what the bigger picture is, right? You're always going to need subject matter experts, but you need enough people that really understand the bigger picture to drive the type of changes that will be successful. All right, so I talked about that planning and approval tool. I want to just give a little flavor for what that tool does and why it matters. So this is a tool that we use for any type of service engagements, and you can use it for service engagement with different recipient types. It can be just for HCPs, it can be for HCPs, HCOs, patients, patient advocacy organizations. But at minimum, let's just look at what we're probably all interested in, and that's the HCP engagements. So when we built our planning and approval tool, and you remember I said, hey, we have to have a centralized FMV process because of our CIA. So what we did, we built this concept of having HCP FMV profiles. And the feeder for that, right, the information about the HCP that was external was our MDM universe. So from our MDM system, we'll get the name, the address, specialty, license numbers, NPIs, etc. But then once that information is pulled into our planning and approval tool to build this record for this one HCP, we then say, okay, we're going to assign the type of HCP they are, right? Is it a physician? Is it a non-physician? Is it, there's a bunch of different ways you can identify the type of HCP. You select the specialty for that HCP, because remember, the specialty coming from your MDM might not exactly tie to the specialties that you use for your FMV. So you need to have a dedicated field that really is for that FMV specialty. And then there's a field for the tier. And tier, think of it as experience. There's a whole bunch of different ways that we can calculate what the experience is. But in general, these are the attributes that are used to determine the maximum allowed rate. So the system would allow the user to create the profile record and enter this information. The system would say the maximum hourly rate you can pay Dr. Sharon Muscato is $400 an hour. Then there was a field that says, what is the assigned hourly rate for Dr. Sharon Muscato? And that's where the business would determine, maybe Dr. Sharon Muscato should only get $300 an hour. Maybe I want to say $500. And because we had it in this tool, we were able to ensure that we kicked off an exception process if they put in a number that was higher than the max allowed. But most often it was just, nope, okay, I'm going to pay Dr. Sharon Muscato $350. It didn't exceed the maximum. The system would lock it, and then the next time, once that profile existed, you don't create another profile. It's there. And what's helpful about that is you can do this profiling piece at any point in time. You don't have to wait for a linear process to kick off. But in parallel, or often at some point in time, there is now, for commercial and medical folks, there's this concept of doing an annual needs assessment. And so we built that into the tool as well, where we said, okay, every year you're going to do an annual needs assessment for your planned service engagements. And we defined what an engagement was. For us, it was a service engagement for one or more HCPs for like the same project, the same scope of work. And a type of engagement would be an advisory board. So that's the example I have here. The business will say, I have a need in the upcoming year to do 10 advisory boards. And for each one of those 10 planned ad boards, I'm going to quantify. I need 3 HCPs for ad board 1. I need 8 HCPs for ad board 2, and what the business purposes are for each of those ad boards. That gets entered into this P&A tool, the planning and approval tool, as the annual needs assessment. And then the annual needs assessment gets submitted through a workflow, right? And you can determine who has to look at that in order to approve it. But the point is, the workflow gets kicked off, it ultimately gets approved. All the data is in there, all information that you plan for each of those 10 ad boards. Now we're in the new year. the business is like, I'm ready to do ad board number 1. The benefit to this is they could literally click a button in their approved annual needs assessment, and that would generate what we called an implementation needs assessment. It takes all the details about that one planned ad board that was entered in the ANA, the annual needs assessment, and now the business has to add more specifics. The date, the venue, they might have to upload an agenda, right? There's more detail because you're closer, you're ready to now implement that ad board. You're still not identifying the HCPs. You're just saying what the activity is, what the, you're quantifying the need and describing it in even more detail than you did in the annual. This then goes into a workflow, and again, ultimately, it would get approved. Here's where the efficiencies are for the business. Now they were able to, because they got the activity approved, they got approval to hire 3 HCPs. They can now say, I'm going to select those HCPs, and they select it from the pool of the HCP FMV profiles. They don't have to assign the rates, it's already assigned. The system knows how many hours they're getting paid because they've already documented that in the annual needs assessment as for the number of hours for the activity. There might be some adjustment in the at the HCP level, right, in these, what I call the contract level record, because maybe one person, the role of that HCP is a chairperson versus a regular participant. All of that was controlled by the system, and we were able to auto-generate, once these records were here, we were able to auto-generate with a push of a button the contract. So this is why it was such a big win for the business. Now there's a little bit more to this, right? There's some more controls in there. There's some attestations that are required from the business. But my point is, and the takeaway is, it was automated, right? In a very efficient, very controlled process. And the last thing I'll say about this, that from a compliance risk perspective, so let's take the scenario where it's this one ad board, and in the ANA, they said that it was going to be the need for 3 HCPs. Now they're implementing and they realize, you know what, they need 2 more. They actually really need 5. If they add another 2 HCPs, if they say now that the need is 5, this allows us to treat it as a deviation. And that means that this needs assessment would actually go through an additional level of approval. In our case, it involved compliance. But if they didn't make any changes to what was already approved in the annual, the implementation needs assessment would just go to legal, right? They're just confirming that the additional details they provided are consistent with what's expected. And then once legal approves this INA, then again, the business can go right to selecting the HCPs. So structuring the data this way helps add those smart controls, right? Because the system's not going to let you add more than 3 if only 3 were approved, but you still have flexibility in that the business could say, I now need 5, but because you've captured the fact that they first said they only needed 3, you can actually add that additional approver to ensure that this, this increase in HCPs is justified. 2 more things I want to say on this, and this goes to the integration piece. These contract level records actually had their own unique, what we called contractual arrangement IDs. And this is really important because if you think about it, that contractual arrangement ID is a way to tie back to the overall engagement, as well as MDM information about that particular service provider or HCP. And then the last thing I want to say is that we also use this process. So the annual needs assessment process, that was done by our commercial and medical affairs folks. But if you were sitting in clinical ops and you wanted to do a steering committee for a clinical trial, or maybe you're in business development and you want to engage some HCPs to explore a potential opportunity. Those functions did not have to follow the annual process. They just went right to what we call the implementation needs assessment. So again, that concept of business rule logic, right? It's the same overarching framework that they're following, very consistent, but it allows for flexibility based upon where they sit in the company. So thinking about this from a cross-border perspective, couple of tips here. On the HCP FMV profiling, it's the country of the HCP that should determine what the FMV classification methodology is and what the rates are, right? So it's the home country of the HCP that, or the country of practice of the HCP that determines fair market value. It's also the country of HCP that determines what type of supporting documentation should be required, right? This is where in the US, you can get CVs that kind of back up your HCP FMV profiles, but trying to get a CV in a country like Japan or a country like Turkey and in Europe where there are really strict privacy requirements, right? So you got to take the country of the HCP into account when you're talking about FMV profiling. That should also drive your approval rules, right? With cross-border, if I'm in the US and I'm engaging, I'm trying to select a French HCP, the country of that HCP should just say, okay, for this HCP that I'm trying to select, I should get someone from the local country to approve my use of that HCP. In the planning and approval section, actually, and I just realized here I misspoke. When I'm talking about the approval rules here, that's more on the FMV profiling. So say I'm setting a profile up for a French HCP and I think he warrants a higher than maximum allowed rate. Well, that exception approval shouldn't go to someone local in the US. It should actually go to the country, the person that owns that HCP in the local country. On planning and approval, right? So now if I want to engage someone for a service, it's for cross-border activities, just keep in mind that there should be separate approvals. Don't think that you should try to approve an ad board and all its recipients using the same exact logic for approval. Think of it as there needs to be approval for the activity, right? And the approver for that business group that owns the activity should be the one that's involved in approving whether or not the activity is allowed. But the HCP selection, that's when, if it's cross-border, that's when that local country should also get involved, right? So that's when, in the case of the French HCP, maybe the French medical director needs to be involved as to whether or not the US business group can engage that particular HCP. For contracting, it's important to distinguish the contracting entity and realize that the contracting entity that you list on that contract should be the entity that's paying for that engagement. Whereas the contract template by the individual participants for that approved activity, that should be determined by the country of the HCP. That's because there are a lot of laws, at the local level that you have to make sure that you adhere to when paying an HCP from another country. And then finally, reporting, just as a best practice, think about capturing the paying entity during your spend collection. A lot of times I've seen different companies just focus on who was receiving the payment, not who was triggering the payment. And recognize that even though you're capturing multiple entities that are paying these different covered recipients, you can still compile that report so that it's reported by one entity, but it's still that data. Knowing who triggered that payment is important, not just for transparency, but for other initiatives like monitoring and analytics. So let's talk a little bit about source system integration. I have this divided here into the type of spend that typically occurs, the common spend system as to how that transactions, where the transactions are processed through, and then some considerations that you might want to keep in mind. So let's look at T&E spend, right? So food and beverage, travel, lodging that's typically paid for using some sort of corporate credit card. Most companies, not all of them, most companies use Concur for these types of transactions. And some considerations you want to keep in mind to kind of connect your transparency infrastructure is establish two types of HCP expenses, and the two types is, hey, do you need a pre-approval ID for this type of expense, or do you not? And so the example is, you know, a fee-for-service meal, you're going to expect that there has to be some sort of pre-approval for that, right? There has to be a consulting agreement, a speaking engagement, etc. Versus an attendee meal, right? Where that's just a participant of a particular event that doesn't have a service contract with the company, but they are getting a transfer of value, right? And the reason why you distinguish between these two types is because it allows you to say, all right, Concur, for this expense type, you need to capture the contractual arrangement ID. Remember that ID I showed you in the earlier slide, that would be fed to the Concur system from the planning and approval tool. Or it's just an attendee mail. That means you just are going to capture the MDM ID for that attendee. Obviously, at least I hope it's obvious, you need to centrally manage and govern these HCP expense types, right? Ownership is key. That's kind of why I ask, you know, who owns this in your organizations? Because I think these areas are so interrelated. I'm a proponent, I'm a fan of thinking that this should be centrally owned and managed by one team. And then leverage the Concur attendee detail report for the data that you need for your transparency reporting. Direct payments, right, where the company is directly paying for services, their grants or external funding, and even some research that typically goes through your ERP system, or we use SAP. I know a lot of other companies use SAP, some use Oracle, but the concept here is ensure that you have some control over the vendor setup so that you can flag vendors that meet your definition of HCP, HCO, or what I call transparency third-party vendor. And then keep in mind, if you do flag vendors, it's really important to have a none of the above or not applicable, because nothing's worse than seeing a blank field in a set of vendor records and you're not sure, did someone just miss this? Or, you know, this means it's not an HCP vendor, right? So always have a value stored in whatever field you're using to flag your vendors. And then for those that you do set up as HCPs, HCOs, and third-party vendors, make sure you store the MDM ID in that. So understand and set up a process where you can ensure you get that unique, your company's unique identifier for that particular individual or organization. Using multi-line requisitions help in enforcing that in the invoicing process. And then store that contractual arrangement ID in both those record types. And then make sure you have a field to classify the nature for each requisition line, so you can distinguish between fees and expense reimbursements. Items, right? A lot of times the field distributes items of value, whether it's textbooks, reprints, or something, anatomical models. This is typically going through your CRM system, right? Because that's the tool that the field uses. This is, again, that central governance and the ability to uniquely identify what it is that they're passing out makes the process a lot easier. I recommend storing that value at least in some sort of centralized tool. It could be just the CRM tool. My experience is it actually makes it a little bit easier if you do it in what I call data lake, right, which is kind of where all this information can come together. And that's because it's often that MedInfo is providing the same reprints that the commercial fields are, but MedInfo, they're not using the CRM tool. So to control the value that you report for these items, for me, it's helpful to do it outside of the CRM tool. There's the functionality in most CRM tools to record leave behinds. That's how we record our transfers of value made by the field. And then, of course, you need to work with your CRM team in order to extract that data. And then we have indirect spend, which is a little bit of everything, right? Third-party HCP payments, our CRO site payments, and even educational items that might be distributed by third parties. I still can't get away from the Excel files, right? They're still providing us with these Excel files, but I do ensure that when we're dealing with third-party vendors, that the contract language actually identifies their responsibility to report data collection to us. And I do not specify the exact data collection methodology in the contract. I reference it, and there's a separate document that talks about the latest and greatest spend collection, right? So that gives us flexibility to modify how vendors are reporting data to us without having to go back and renegotiate their contract. Also, make sure that you leverage, you have some way to actually identify your third-party vendors. We actually use our planning and approval tool. When they're doing their needs assessment and they're doing that ad board, we actually have the business identify how that the HCPs will be paid for that ad board. Are they being paid out of SAP, or are they being paid by third-party vendors? And if they're being paid by third-party vendors, they have to identify those third-party vendors. So that's our trigger to say, hey, this is a new vendor. We need to make sure that both the business and the vendor understand what their reporting requirements are. And for us, it's the vendor has to give us that detailed breakout when submitting any invoice to the company, and the business is involved in that as well, right? Because they're the ones that's approving the invoice, so the business needs to make sure that their vendor, the vendor they engage, are also providing us with the more detailed breakout of those payments. All right, so here's the last polling question. I know we're getting a little short on time, so I'm going to try to speed this up a little bit. But if you don't mind, Mohammed, and opening up the polling so people can respond to the scope of your spend collection.
Sure, I just did that, Sharon. I think very valuable presentation so far. I'm enjoying it, but I think as you said, we're coming close to time. So if folks have additional questions, they can certainly ask. All right, so what is the scope of your spend collections effort? Responses are only that which is reportable, everything. You basically collect all the spend, somewhere in the middle, or you're currently not sure. We've had some responses. I'll give another 20 seconds or so. We have one, I think, easy question that has come up. What does MDM stand for? I can respond to that on your behalf, Sharon. MDM is Master Data Management, which is your repository for your healthcare professionals, where you keep a record of, or a golden copy, or a single record of all the physicians or healthcare professionals that you might engage with. It's usually managed by IT, and it's across the enterprise. If you want to add something there, Sharon, feel free to. I think we have a good number of responses, so I'll close the poll out so you can get a picture. Looks like the results for the poll are we have about 80% or 78% to be exact, attendees responding to everything, so they capture all their spend, and then 11% are somewhere in the middle, and 11% are not sure.
Got it.
Back to you, Sharon. I think we have 2 minutes, so I don't know if you want to wrap up quickly.
I'm going to wrap up with really just this for MDM. So this is the example. It's really helpful to broadly define your recipient types, right? So capturing everything, don't just focus on physicians, because that's what's currently reportable for Sunshine. Think more broadly than that. So this is how we set up our categories of HCPs, and these are all, we capture spend for all of these HCP types, even non-licensed, what I call policy HCPs, right, where we include payers, PhD researchers, etc. Okay, this is the last slide, I promise, and I'm going to go through it quick. Gives you, and you're going to get these slides, but this is how we pull all these different elements together, right? So we have what we call the spend system, where the transactions happen. we have our planning and approval system here in purple, and we have our MDM universe in blue. And this area is what we call our data lake. And we implement a data integration tool that actually instructs how these data sets are married, right? And that means they're taking the who, the what, and the when, combining it with the why, and then they're able to push those views of that data to the different tools, such as our transparency reporting tool and even our monitoring and analytics module. And the big takeaway here is that all of this really requires ownership. So it's not just about spend collection and reporting, but it's also about those front end processes like the HCP engagements. In my view, that ownership should be function agnostic. And I also strongly recommend that it's not IT. IT helps you connect the pipes, but they don't always appreciate and have a full understanding of the water flowing through those pipes, right? The context. So in my world, this is why our team, our transparency operations team, typically become the owner, or certainly a stakeholder in this process and a voice in how it all comes together. So with that, I know I'm a good minute over now. I can stay on if anyone does have questions, and I'm certainly able to respond if anyone has any, wants to send me an email. My contact information will be part of the deck, but I really appreciate your time, and I'll shoot it back over to Mohammed to see if there are any other questions that maybe came through.
Sure. There are questions, Sharon, and I realize for the audience, if you are over time and if you want to disconnect at this point, or it's your choice if you want to continue on. We do have a few questions we'll ask Sharon while we have her on the call.
Absolutely.
And of course, we're going to get that. Everyone's going to get it in recording, so you can definitely take a look at it back. Sharon, just my observation when I noted the way you're presenting and the slide deck that has those IT diagrams and those data flow diagrams, it looks like you have this sort of skill set of the business acumen of compliance, but also this data or tech savviness that makes you kind of the right person to be leading some of this type of initiatives. And by and large, that's a very unique skill set. And even though more and more that's kind of the requirement of the compliance role, because compliance teams are now expected to have a good grip on the entire data set going or flowing in their organization, right? That's kind of the expectation from an outside perspective, even though that skill set is really, as I said, really unique and I think very hard to find. So when I look at this presentation, it feels like you have a good grip on both of those areas. However, I think in most compliance teams, that technology aspect of crafting a generic solution that works in modules to create this sort of orchestration or rhythm of how the data will flow is going to be really hard for compliance teams. And in that scenario, what would be your recommendation for someone to take on such a large kind of orchestrated technology project?
So great question. And yeah, I do think that this is an opportunity for compliance professionals to build additional skill sets, right? Or to attract additional skill sets. I think to get there, I would absolutely start slow, right? Kind of like just recognize, because if you look back or just remember the journey I walked through, we started with very basic information, right? And I think it's okay to still do it that way. What I would caution against is, or maybe I'll restate it a different way. I think you always have to manage it under the present environment, but you have to always have an eye on that future, right? And where you want to go. Kind of that's where the strategy comes in. And part of that is recognizing, okay, well, what skills do we need that we might not have, and how do we attract that talent to maybe get here? And really what I see is the ability to hire individuals that understand data and technology, but have a curiosity and an ability to learn the business, right? They're not going to know. I mean, when I came into this, I actually came into pharmaceuticals from the financial services industry. I didn't even know what an HCP was, right? So I think it's really finding people that are agile in their ability to learn from a business perspective. But to your point, Mohammed, they need to understand technology and data probably better than historically most compliance people have in the past.
Thank you for the response. And I think, beyond just the skill set required within compliance teams, I think this is also a great avenue for vendors to play, right? Someone that can build something to this extent that's modular, configurable, works at a global scale, could really provide a lot of value here.
And that can coach the business, right? So, and I think you're absolutely right. There are vendors there that can help the compliance organization develop their own capabilities in this area. My caution is only like, don't just look for that magical tool or that magical vendor, right? I really think there is value in building capabilities from within. But to your point, absolutely, you got to rely on external assistance and the tools, and be partners with these vendors to help their tools become even more helpful to the business.
Right. No, absolutely. And, regardless of where the push comes in the vision, I think embarking on a journey like this. So the question I have is, it took you several years to get here, and
yep.
Of course you're redoing it again at Lexion because you're comfortable with the solution. And when I heard you speak today, it was very obvious that something like this has to be in place, at least for any organization that claims to have any semblance of a global kind of operational footprint. Pieces of this must be in place. And so I guess my question there is, it took you 4 years, and when we look at the industry in general, a lot of compliance teams are still at the point where it's barely managing to collect the spend for reporting, right? Compliance has traditionally been underfunded, under budgeted, and creating this level of I guess program hasn't been the top priority for organizations. Yeah. It's really either put things in spreadsheets to get it to reporting, which as you and I know leads to not only just misreported and errors in the transactions, but also bypasses all the compliance controls that eventually create all the risks that people get in trouble for. So what would be your recommendation for small mid-tier companies where the budgets are limited? What portions can they take from here and really leverage?
So you're right. That's a continual struggle, and I guess that's why I always try to sell this approach as a win for the business, right? So the concept of the efficiencies that could be gained, right? And because if you get commercial, medical affairs, right, the revenue generating functions behind you, and they see the value in what you're trying to do, you actually get the buy-in. So I would focus on not just when you're trying to propose changes or some of these approaches, not just approaching it from a transparency perspective or from a compliance perspective, but really as efficiencies for the business and insights for the business, right? If we go back to this view, this level of information, I guarantee you the business would benefit from a lot of these insights because they too struggle, right? They don't always know, well, how do I know what my HCPs are being used by R&D, right? That visibility isn't there. So it's really taking the perspective or spinning the story so that you tell it more from the business perspective as to why this would be so valuable.
Okay, no, that makes sense. And then, yeah, I mean, getting the business engaged into this process with highlights of what they will get from a value delivery would be, I guess, one angle to kind of look at. The last question I have had is, you talk a lot about smart controls, and then also one thing that I found interesting in your slides earlier on was the HCP contract generation and storage module.
Yeah, that
I
was
think
huge.
that's phenomenal, right? I mean, being able to create that module. If you can talk a little bit about, how you created that, the contract generation piece. Was it where you had just templates that the system would assemble based on the type of activity and the FME rate and the physician and the country, or was it something different? And then also, if you can talk a little bit about some of those smart controls, the conflict of interest checks, etc., that you put in place, and then after that, we'll call it a day.
Sure. So I'll start with the controls first. So because it kind of is cyclical, you had to pass all the controls before you were able to push that button, right, to generate a contract, right? That was actually one of the controls. And so the controls that I mentioned, so fair market value was certainly one of them. The cap management, right? So let's say that they were selecting someone for an ad board. The ad board was approved. They're now selecting Dr. Sharon Muscato, and they would put, because it was a full day ad board, it was going to be 8 hours plus 2 hours of prep, plus times my hourly rate, would give the number of fees that were expected to be paid to Dr. Sharon Muscato if we move forward with this contract for this ad board with Dr. Sharon Muscato. Behind the scenes, the system was saying, okay, well, this is an ad board. It's subject to cap, right? So that means the fees need to go towards Sharon Muscato's cap. And the system would say, what have we committed to Sharon Muscato so far for this calendar year? It doesn't matter if payments had occurred, because to manage cap based on the payment, you're already too late. So we manage cap on the front end. That's where the control is, right? We would never commit to more than what was allowed to under cap in a particular calendar year. And so one of the controls was, if there wasn't room in my cap, the system would say you have to pick another HCP. There's, this engagement would put Dr. Sharon Muscato over her cap. The conflict of interest check was, behind the scenes, we manage, and this goes to our definitions framework concept, where we define our activities. And it's not just defining what the activity is, it's also flagging other attributes about that activity, and whether or not, in this case, independence is required. So there's a type of activity that's called an independent data safety monitoring committee. It's a very specific type of clinical trial committee. And the FDA guidance is that by independent, that means that the HCP has no other financial obligation to the sponsor. And so the way we manage that is, if I am doing an engagement, right, I have approval to do an independent data safety monitoring committee. The system is, when they select Dr. Sharon Muscato again, the system in the back is going to check not just what her cap status is, it's going to realize, oh, this requires independence. Is Dr. Sharon Muscato actively engaged for any other activity right, now, during the time frame that this new engagement is supposed to occur? And if so, it would say this is likely a conflict of interest. We wouldn't stop it. We would actually put a little workflow around there, because sometimes we could allow this activity. But the point is, there was a control there, and it was a smart one. It was automated. Conversely, if I'm now doing an ad board, I'm in medical affairs, and I want to choose Dr. Sharon Muscato for this ad board, and I've already been selected for the independent data safety monitoring committee, the system's not going to let me be selected for this ad board, because that would be a conflict of interest. I'm already on an engagement that requires independence. But the way that was managed was how we configured our activity types. right? The information, when we defined them in the system, we had these flags and indicators as part of our activity type data object, if you will, and that helped drive the system behavior to manage that type of smart control. And then lastly, on the contract generation, yes, it's very much tied to activities in that activity table. So what we did, and you might, if folks are still on the line, they realize when they're doing contracts, a lot of it is simple, right? You just have to, if there's a name field, you plug in the name of the HCP. Number of hours, simple. You push that data element, that field, from the planning and approval tool into the mail merge that's going to generated a PDF copy of this contract, right? But it was a simple mail merge. But what was more sophisticated was a lot of times you have SOWs as part of the contract, and there is a description of the services that's going to be achieved through the execution of that SOW. And that's very specific to the activity, right? So the description of the services for an ad board is different than the description of services for content development. And so it was within that activity table that we would store what we called the SOW service text, right? And that was a pretty dynamic field. Like we were actually able to, on the fly, display additional fields that needed to be populated for that particular description of services. But it was all controlled through this activity type module that my team would control, so that when the business went to generate the contract, it literally was a push of a button. All that required data got pushed into the template. A PDF was generated and stored within that record within the planning and approval tool. And then the business took it from there to go get it executed, and they would have to upload the signed contract, but there was no worry about, oh, someone's going to put the wrong rate on this, or someone's going to put more hours than what was approved. So it was a really tight, controlled, and very efficient process.
That's wonderful. I've seen the contract back and forth and the language changes and the, you know, that drive legal compliance and business teams nuts over it. So at least having that process, you know, I think it's, as you said, I think you're staying true to your mantra of compliance and efficiency are not mutually exclusive.
Yes,
and I
that's
see that with what you've done so far. So in the interest of time, I think we'll have to close it. I know we have almost 50% of the attendees are still on the webinar, so I guess the Q&A was valuable, even in, you know, and that's why we continued to have you, Sharon. Really valuable information, Sharon. I enjoyed the full presentation and a lot of key takeaways for me, even from a systems perspective of what we can build to help pharma and device compliance teams. So thank you, everyone, for your time and input today. We're going to publish this recording of the video, and if you need to reach out to Sharon, we'll publish her contact information as well, so you have access to ask any questions. And if you need any help, whether it's transparency, reporting, compliance data, you know, we at Core Data have helped 25 different pharma companies, so we're happy to assist in any way that we can. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Sharon, for your time.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks so much, Mohammed. Take care, everyone.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.